Hello everyone, and welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to start moving down through the atmosphere, getting away from satellites and talking about aircraft. All right, talk about aircraft. And in specific, I want to sort of make a distinction here. And we kind of made this distinction when we drew our original graphic when we talked about drones versus airplanes, but I want to make a distinction here that they're really both aircraft, and the distinction comes in terms of the pilot. All right, so what we're going to be talking about in this video is what are called piloted aircrafts, meaning there's a pilot on board, right, or the pilot is on board, right? And these are the things that you would typically think of when you think of an airplane, right? You're flying in a Boeing from New York to California, right? You're sitting in your seat and there's somebody at the front of the plane who is actually driving the plane, right? That's piloted. And from a remote sensing perspective, right, we have much smaller planes that we stick cameras underneath, but there's still someone sitting in the cockpit actually flying it. The other option are what are called remote piloted. Right. And you'll sometimes see these called unpiloted or unmanned, or most often you'll see them referred to as drones. But they're really just remote piloted aircraft because at the end of the day, somebody is still controlling them. Right? They're just doing it remotely, either with actual remote control or with some GPS waypoints that they programmed, but somebody is still in charge of the drone. It's not just sort of flying itself, at least not now, flying itself without any supervision at all. So there is somebody still in charge of it, right? But the pilot is not on board, right? The pilot is not on board, okay? But in this video, I want to focus on piloted, and then in the next video, we'll get into the remote piloted. And what I want to do is talk about sort of the advantages of piloted aircraft, especially in contrast to the satellites that we talked about before. And so I want to do the same thing we did with satellites. Let's give ourselves a little more space. And I want to do the same thing we did with satellites in terms of that pros and cons list. All right, pros, cons. And I'm going to start with probably the number one biggest pro. And it actually encompasses a lot of subcategories. But the biggest pro for aircraft is flexibility. Right, and I'm underlining it 3 times because flexibility is probably the number one reason that we're going to use an aircraft over a satellite. And this really breaks down into 3 categories. Right? The first category is what kind of data you can collect. Right. And what I mean by this is, if you remember back to our discussion on satellites, right, I sort of said that the major con of satellites was that lack of flexibility. And the point that I made was if you launch a satellite and the next week somebody drops some groundbreaking technology, right, you can't go back and incorporate that into your satellite. Right? Or put another way, once you launch the satellite, that's the only type of data that satellite will ever give you. So if you launch a satellite that collects 5 bands, right, has 5 regions of the electromagnetic spectrum that it's measuring, you will never be able to get that satellite to measure a 6th, right? You'll never be able to get those bands to be more wavelength specific. Right? Once you launch the satellite, you're done. Right? But with aircraft, what you can do is you can land the plane, right? You can land the plane after you've acquired imagery once, and you can say, hey, this research team has this really cool new sensor. Let's integrate it, right? And you can put that new sensor in the airplane, and then starting tomorrow, right, you can take that airplane out and you can get an entirely different kind of data set. You can get more wavelengths. You can get more specific bands that target very specific features, right? So that's the major benefit of an airplane, is that you have a lot more fine scale control over what kind of data you're collecting, right? You also have more control over when you collect your data. Right. So if you remember back when I was talking about satellites, we talked about that sun synchronous, and we said that it goes around the globe taking imagery, and it has that sort of revisit time. And I use the example of Landsat, where every 2 weeks, right, Landsat circles back and you get a picture of the Earth in the same place every 2 weeks, right? And I said, well, what happens if you want a picture every 7 days? With Landsat, the only real option you have is to launch another satellite, right? But with aircraft, I can just call up my provider, my company that I've chosen, and be like, hey, I'll give you some more money. Will you please fly this again next week? And they would most likely be willing to do that for you. In addition to that, with a satellite, right, not only do we have that fixed revisit time, right, we can only get imagery every 2 weeks in the case of Landsat. But let's just say that on the time that the Landsat satellite is passing over, actually, let's draw a diagram of that, right? Right, here, so I don't mess up our table, let's slide over for a minute. Right? Let's say we have the Earth's surface, right, Earth. Right? And we have our Landsat satellite overhead, and it's trying to take an image of the Earth's surface. Right? And this is the time, right? This window is the only time for the next 2 weeks that we're going to get an image of this particular portion of the Earth's surface. If we don't get a good image now, we have to wait 2 more weeks for it to come back. And let's just say that for a variety of meteorological reasons, there's a big old fluffy cloud, right in front of our area here. Oh, whoa. There's a big old fluffy cloud right in front of our area here. Right. So this satellite is taking a picture of a cloud, and that's not particularly helpful for most applications. Right. But with an aircraft, you can check the weather report and you can say, okay, well, Tuesday is going to be mostly cloudy, and we don't want clouds or cloud shadows in our image. So we're going to fly on Wednesday instead. Right? So that's the kind of flexibility you get. If you realize there's going to be some clouds, with a satellite, you don't have a choice. You just get it and you lost an image. With aircraft, you can say, okay, we're going to fly the next day. It might be a little bit better. Right? So that's in terms of the when, right? You can control how frequently you get it, and you can also control if weather is going to be particularly bad. Right? You can change your days up a little bit to get better imagery. And finally, right, and this is probably the biggest reason in terms of flexibility, and that is your spatial resolution. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and actually make this its own pro, right? Its own pro. Let me undo that. Right. Let's make this its own pro. Spatial resolution. And so to sort of give you an idea here, right? Some of the best, most high resolution satellites that we have give us resolutions on the order of, so let's go over here. Right, satellites. The best we have is about 1 meter, which is, to just do some quick math, is 100 centimeters. Right, that's at best. At worst, with Landsat, well, actually, moderate, right? So Landsat's considered moderate. We have 30 meter. And then at the very worst, we have 1 kilometer, right? So we have 1 meter, 30 meter, 1 kilometer for satellites, right? For aircraft, again, these are piloted aircraft. Piloted aircraft, we're talking you can pay for imagery that is 30 centimeters. And this is pretty standard, right? Or you can pay for imagery that's half a foot. Right? So you're talking about something that is significantly less than a satellite, right? You're going from 100 centimeters. Right? So that means the length of one side of the pixel is a meter versus something where the length of one side of a pixel is 30 centimeters to 6 inches. Right? And we've seen in some of the labs that we've done what a drastic impact, right? What a drastic impact that change can make. So those are the two big cons. Or big pros, right? We have flexibility over what kind of data we can get and when we can get it. And then just by virtue of being closer to the Earth's surface, we have higher spatial resolutions. Let's talk about the cons. Right? And there's really 2 cons. And we're going to talk about this. The first con is cost. Right? We're going to talk about this talk later. We're going to have an entire video dedicated to how much these different things cost. But you're going to see that aerial imagery is probably one of the most expensive forms of imagery that we really can get. The other thing, and this is probably the bigger thing, is that you lack an image archive. And what I mean by lacking an image archive, right, if we go back to talking about satellites for a second, right, with satellites, you have that set revisit time. So again, cherry picking Landsat as an example, right? I have an image of every location on Earth every 2 weeks, going back basically to the mid 1970s, right? Every 2 weeks. And other satellites have added additional imagery, right? Other satellites have their own revisit times. And in some cases, we get daily imagery, right? But with airplanes, right, with aircraft, right, that archive is basically only whenever the people decide that they want to actually right. With aircraft, that revisit time, right, that archive is really only whenever the people decide to go out and fly. And that typically means whenever somebody pays them. So one of the biggest examples of a long-term aerial imaging campaign is the National Imagery Agricultural Program, or NAIP, right, NAIP. And NAIP has been running since 2007, 2008. And the NAIP program was designed to capture imagery every 4 years, right, on a rolling basis across the country. So if you were imaged in, say, 2008, you were imaged again in 2012, you were imaged again in 2016, and then you were imaged again or will be imaged again in 2020. Right, so if you think about that, right, if you were to go from Landsat, right, you'd have an image every 2 weeks from 2008 2008 to 2020. If you were to go with NAIP, you'd have 4 images in total. That's what I mean when I say you lack an image archive. And then the third is a lack of global coverage. Right, a lack of global coverage. And what I mean by this is exactly what it sounds like. You only have imagery where people have paid to be flown. So, for example, they don't have NAIP in South America, right? South America didn't pay for the producers of NAIP to go down and fly imagery for them, right? That doesn't exist. Another popular imaging system for aircraft is called Avarice, and Avarice is hyperspectral, right? It's probably one of the best hyperspectral data sets that we have. And the thing with Avarice is that, again, it only flies where people tell it to fly. So you can go through and you can look at the entire Avarice data set, all the Avarice data that's ever been collected. And you will see that the vast majority of it is along coastlines. There was a huge surge in Avarice data collection during the Gulf Coast oil spills, right? But outside of that, and some wildfires and some various other things, right? Well, there isn't a whole lot of Avarice data. So if you wanted to get Avarice data for, say, your neighborhood for some reason, right, you may not be able to do that. That's what I mean when I say that it lacks global coverage. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, we'll talk later about cost. Just know that it's expensive. Know that for any given area, it's unlikely that you're going to have more than 4 or 5 images going back through time. And know that with air photos, you may not be able to get it everywhere on the globe. Hopefully that makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.